Horror movies can be traced back to the 1890s and would start to take hold of audiences in the first half of the 1900s with a host of memorable characters which live on to this day. A wide range of subgenres would come from the overarching title of horror, and we now have a wide range of movies to suit our individual tastes. But where did they start? From classic monsters to axe-wielding maniacs, today's list takes us through 5 movies that defined and changed the genre of horror forever. Welcome to Horror Stories. I'm starting off this list in no particular order with Psycho. Released in 1960, Psycho was directed by the legend Alfred Hitchcock and starred Janet Leigh, who is the mother of Scream Queen Jamie Lee Curtis. Psycho paved the way for what was to come in the future of horror, and you could say that it was the beginning of the slasher genre. John Carpenter's Halloween was hugely influenced by this movie. He even went as far as to name one of his characters after a character in Psycho. This movie has definitely become an all-time classic, but it wasn't without its fair share of controversy. Psycho was one of the first movies to portray scenes of violence in such detail, as well as scenes of a sexual nature. Audiences and critics were shocked to see scenes of murder, blood, corpses, and underwear. This, along with killing the movie star halfway through, was unimaginable at the time. We can't talk about Psycho without talking about that shower scene. This scene has gone down in history as one of the most famous scenes in all of film. Continuous recreations within pop culture have ensured you know this scene even if you haven't watched the movie. Before Psycho, most horror movies were monster movies such as Dracula, Frankenstein, and Creature from the Black Lagoon. Psycho is the first depiction of a seemingly shy human man who is carrying around these monsters inside, and how they can manifest into hideous acts of violence. This again brought negative attention to the movie, as people no longer felt like they were watching a work of fiction. People began wondering about the very real possibility of this happening in their lives. Psycho can be credited as the foundation for the next 20 years in slasher, sparking a surge in movies which showed more violence, more nudity, and touched on some of the more real subjects in life. Without this movie, we would not have a slasher genre today. Next on our list, we have John Carpenter's Halloween. This movie released in 1978 and starred a debut in Jamie Lee Curtis. Psycho may have laid down the foundations for the future of slasher, but Halloween wrote the rules. Halloween gave us our first real icon of slasher. Although not the first to portray a masked killer with a unique look, that credit goes to Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Halloween was the first to successfully thrust our killer into the public eye, making Michael Myers a pop culture icon for years to come. Myers himself is a huge reason for this movie becoming so iconic. A seemingly indestructible force of nature but still a human was never portrayed before Halloween. Most killers prior were shown as average everyday people who had no distinctive look or feel about them. Myers, sporting his famous boiler suit, expressionless white mask, and a lack of speech, made for a perfect combination to scare audiences, which we saw in repeated copycat series like Friday the 13th. On the subject of scaring audiences, can we talk about that soundtrack for a second? One of the things that makes this movie so great is the incredibly eerie score by director John Carpenter. Halloween really taught us how music can be so influential in building suspense and being a storytelling device. We knew as soon as that score hit, someone was gonna get got. We can also thank Halloween for the rules all of our favourite slashers follow. The vulnerable final girl character that turns into a badass and confronts the killer can be traced back to this movie, with Jamie Lee Curtis's character doing everything she can to survive. We also get the classic trope of if you're gonna have sex and do drugs, then you best be prepared to get stabbed. Halloween would go on to become a huge franchise. Although it may go completely off the rails, we can thank this classic movie for breathing a new era of slasher into the genre. Next up, we have Wes Craven's Scream. Released in 1996, by the time the 90s had come round, we were out of the crazy no-holds-barred horror of the 80s, and studios seemed lost on where to go next. Slasher was dying, with Halloween, Friday the 13th, and the Nightmare movies being the last giants of the genre standing, but all seemingly going off the rails at the same time. And enter stage right, Ghostface. Scream was a brand new take on slasher and breathed some very much needed new life into the genre. This movie was a very self-aware movie, understanding the tropes of slasher and even in some cases poking fun at it. Living in a meta world and acknowledging the movies we have come to know and love, we get well-informed characters such as Randy, who is a horror nerd and is consistently telling everyone how to survive a horror movie.
There's a formula to it. A very simple formula. Everybody's a suspect!
We have a well-informed killer who takes a step back from the supernatural, indestructible beings the genre had become, and brings us to a time where the killer could be your neighbor or a school friend who has those same monsters inside our friend from Psycho had. Our killer also has wit and regularly quotes lines from horror movies like this classic line from the aforementioned Psycho.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
Scream opened the gates for a new wave of movies being made, taking tropes of classic slashers and Scream itself. We got movies which broke down the barriers and were slightly more self-aware, and we would see more horror movie loving characters involved. Movies such as I Know What You Did Last Summer and Urban Legend can all thank Scream for bringing horror back to the minds of audiences. We would even go on to see staples in the genre such as Halloween and Jason make comebacks, but this time we would see them carrying just a little bit of Scream with them. From the evolution of slashers, we come to the creation of the modern-day zombie. Night of the Living Dead was released in 1968 and directed by George A. Romero. Before the movie's release, zombies fell into the same category as the gothic monsters you would have seen 30 years before. The first depiction of zombies was in 1932's White Zombie, but these weren't the zombies we love today. These were mind-controlled servants that didn't hunger for human brains. Movies such as 1964's Last Man on Earth could be defined as the first modern-day zombie movie, with the dead rising from their graves. But in this movie, they are referred to as vampires and carry all the tropes you would assume from vampires, including hatred of garlic and needing to be stabbed in the heart with a stake to be killed. The phrase zombie was not popularized until Night of the Living Dead's release, where from that day on, we knew our zombies would be hungry for brains and flesh.
Coming to get you, Barbara.
Night of the Living Dead also introduced to the now common theme of once bitten, you turn. This had never been the case with zombies in the past and made for a terrifying audience reaction seeing the results of a zombie bite for the first time. Later zombie movies would expand on what Night of the Living Dead started, adding intelligence and running aspects to the zombies, making for some great movies over the years. Even games and comedic depictions can all take pointers from the foundations that Night of the Living Dead laid down. Moving on from zombies, we are heading straight down into Supernatural Town. Up next, we have Insidious. It may seem out of place on this list full of older classic movies, but Insidious definitely deserves a spot on any list of genre-changing movies. Released in 2010 and directed by James Wan, this movie brings something completely new to the paranormal genre of horror. Prior to this movie, there would be similar aspects found in Paranormal Activity, but in my opinion, Insidious takes those aspects and turns it up to 100. James Wan, who already had success restarting a subgenre with Saw, is flexing his muscles again in a style we have never seen before, but we now continue to see with movies such as Sinister, Mama, and The Babadook, all trying to replicate the scares we saw in Insidious. Insidious kickstarted a 4-movie franchise, and the success most certainly prompted James Wan to replicate this in The Conjuring, which has then gone on to create a wide universe of spin-offs and stories. Maybe a now played out formula due to the wave of movies trying to piggyback on the success this movie saw. Every movie we see adopting this formula has Insidious to thank for bringing this type of intense horror to our screens. Unfortunately, not every movie can make the list, but here's a couple of honorable mentions. Before Frankenstein, The Mummy, and Creature of the Black Lagoon, there was Dracula. Released in 1931, this adaptation of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel is perhaps the first horror movie audiences ever witnessed. Although this may seem crazy now, but depictions of scenes involving loud screams of death and Dracula's brides was censored from the movie. Even scenes showing bugs had to be censored. Like I said, this seems crazy, but these were things that had never been shown on screens before. The production code must have had an absolute field day with this movie. This movie would become the blueprint for all depictions of Dracula in the future, and there's been a lot of them. You could say this popularized the showing of vampires altogether. Dracula also kickstarted the Universal Monsters train, with Frankenstein coming out later the same year. Our other honourable mention is The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. Stay with me here, I promise by the end of this you're going to want to know more. The Bird with the Crystal Plumage is an Italian giallo movie released in 1970 and has been credited as the movie which thrust the giallo genre into popularity. What is giallo and why is this movie here? I'm glad you asked. Giallo is a genre of Italian horror which is themed around murder mystery and graphic slasher scenes. It's also personally one of my favourite genres. Without the success of this movie and other early works of Giallo, we may never have had Black Christmas and many other slasher movies. Impressive practical effects and violence paved the way for movies of the 70s and 80s and enabled them to go that little bit further with themes and the showing of violence and nudity that may have been considered too much at the time. I definitely recommend looking up the works of Dario Argento and seeing these movies for yourself. And that's our video. Do you have any other suggestions for movies that changed horror? Let me know down in the comments.
Careful. This is the moment when the supposedly dead killer comes back to life for one last scare.
Thank you so much for watching, guys, and thank you so much for the love on the first video. I hope you enjoyed this one, and if you're new, welcome in. I hope to see you all next time, and remember, stay spooky.